the year 1941, when the doors of the National Gallery of Art in Washington were first opened to the public, a great war was being fought. A war for the preservation of those human values and that culture which are represented by the treasures of the gallery. The opening of the gallery realized a dream of the great American philanthropist Andrew Mellon, who believed that through an understanding and appreciation of what this building holds, our lives would have more meaning. This enrichment of life is being realized by hundreds of thousands of visitors who come annually to share in these treasures, which in times past only princes or millionaires could hope to enjoy. So let us set out on a voyage of discovery to see how each epoch in its own way speaks out to posterity.
Salve Regina.
This image of the Virgin was painted in the Byzantine tradition not long after the year 1200. The Byzantine style was based on images which had been handed down unchanged for almost 1,000 years. The artist made no effort to render his object realistically, for this was a formal, symbolic art in which not only the artist's beliefs, but his very style were dictated by the church. Some crusaders of the Fourth Crusade probably brought this panel from the East to Italy, where the Byzantine tradition was virtually the only style of painting which generations of artists had known and practiced. Then, about 1300, a change took place. In this painting of the calling of the apostles Peter and Andrew, Duccio of Siena still used much of the old Byzantine style with a gold background and rigid figures. But in details such as the net and the fish, we can see the first attempts to render nature more realistically. While Duccio was breaking with the age-old tradition in Siena, in the rival city of Florence, the artist Giotto developed this awareness of nature into a new dimension in art. To us, his art may still look stiff and formal. But to men of his day, Giotto's painting was marvelously realistic. His contemporary Boccaccio said of Giotto,
"There was nothing in nature but he could not imitate it. Therefore, having brought that art again to light, which had lain buried for many ages, he may deservedly be called one of the lights and glories of our city."
And for 100 years, artists were content to follow along the course Giotto had charted. Then came the period of the Renaissance, or rebirth. As if the blinds of the Dark Ages, the period of man's preoccupation with the other world, had been pushed aside, and man rediscovered a world which his senses could appreciate and his mind explore with liberty. Here the artist Benozzo Gozzoli paints an intense tragedy. Salome enraptures the king, who grasps a knife with one hand and touches his heart with the other. Two monks, the painters Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi, summed up their feelings and faith in this magnificent picture of the adoration of the Magi. Here is a Renaissance pageant, an inaugural parade of the races of mankind before the child king. A parade closely resembling the popular processions held by the Medici, the rulers of Florence. In such processions, shields were often carried. Like this unique processional shield, painted by Andrea del Castagno about 1450. Artists began to study anatomy in order to convey the impression of motion. Castagno's wind-blown David seems to be shouting his triumph to the world. Goliath, conquered by youthful David, in paint and in stone. The creative powers of the early Renaissance affected all the arts. Donatello, in soft-hued Italian marble, set the pace for generations of sculptors to come. The Renaissance was a time of turmoil, in human spirit as well as in politics. Here, molded in fire-hardened clay, an image, a symbol of the 15th century Florence. Its ruler, Lorenzo the Magnificent. How perfectly Andrea Verrocchio reveals his character. Generous to his friends, cruel and ruthless to his enemies, Lorenzo exacted a terrible vengeance against the conspirators who murdered his brother Giuliano on the steps of the high altar in the cathedral in Florence. Here is his brother Giuliano, painted after the murder by another Florentine master, Sandro Botticelli. The turtle dove here symbolizes the sorrow and devotion of Lorenzo for his murdered brother Giuliano. The 15th century was coming to an end. While Columbus studied his maps, while sailing ships set out to explore the world, the fine arts assumed a place of first importance in the culture of Renaissance Italy. With Raphael, Renaissance painting reached its peak. His St. George and the Dragon, painted in 1505, is probably the most perfectly preserved example of his work anywhere in the world. As background for his figures, he painted familiar landscapes from his native Italy. His Madonnas expressed the Christian ideal of the Virgin's motherhood. Like Raphael in Rome, Giorgione in Venice used his neighbors as actors in the life of Christ. Here, steeped in the golden evening light, which fused the models with the surrounding atmosphere. In contrast to this peaceful, poetic landscape of Giorgione, his fellow Venetian, Tintoretto, uses nature almost as an actor in this tumultuous composition of Christ appearing to his disciples at the Sea of Galilee. Seeing Tintoretto's painting, the French critic Taine exclaimed,
"The prodigious and superhuman quality of his genius shakes ordinary placid souls."
As the 16th century passes into the 17th, the first great prophet of modern art appears, El Greco. El Greco was more than a prophet. He also expressed the spirit of his own time, that ardent and mystical piety which was the answer of the Catholic Church to the Reformation, its defense against the crumbling unity of Christianity. El Greco, the Greek who turned Spaniard, painted this story of Laocoon in the ancient Spanish city of Toledo, which he so often used as a background for the stately figures of his saints and heroes. Wrote poet Jean Cocteau,
hidden rhythm is developed from one end to another of Greco's canvases. Never mind about those square clouds, or that flat face, or that enormous leg. Nature must obey and allow herself to be used to fill such spaces as this imperious master may assign to her.
But the Renaissance was not confined to the Mediterranean alone. Let us cross the Alps to Northern Europe and turn back in time to the beginning of the 15th century when the brothers Van Eyck initiated the northern style of Renaissance painting. The Annunciation is an example of their art. Jan Van Eyck, with the recently perfected technique of painting in oils, was able to convey hitherto unobtainable effects of realism. Of him, a great historian said,
"Time, unity, and harmony are not lost in the accumulation of details. It is the privilege of the painter that he can give rein to his craving for endless elaboration without sacrificing the general effect."
The precision of Flemish painting was suited to the firm and sure hand of his fellow countryman, Roger van der Weyden. With his warm but keen insight, van der Weyden has left us not only a diagram of a face, but also the portrait of an aristocratic personality. In contrast to the subtle psychological insight of the Flemish artists, the Germans developed a style of concise recording of fact with a brush. This is a 16th century portrait of the future King of England, Edward VI, by Hans Holbein the Younger. During the 17th century, portrait painting attained a special place among the arts. In this field, the Spaniard Velázquez was one of the outstanding artists of all time. In his painting of Innocent X, he has portrayed the Pope with the same absolute detachment shown by Holbein. But he has also caught Innocent the man, his embittered look, the tortured suspicion, and the irresolute cunning of his life. In contrast, the fashionable and prolific Anthony van Dyck was less concerned with the inner life of his subject. He shows us people as they wish to be. In portraying the nobility of the Stuart era as heroes and statesmen, he realized their fondest ambitions. But small, everyday scenes also fascinated the painters of the Low Countries. In this small picture, Vermeer gives a sample of his technical mastery of brush and palette. And here is another example of Vermeer's craftsmanship. It was during this period that a giant appeared, Rembrandt van Rij, whose self-portrait we see. This landscape, painted about 1650, shows how Rembrandt used light to focus our attention on the important parts of a picture. All other details are lost in deep shadows. When misfortune overtook Rembrandt, the ruined artist moved to the Jewish quarter, and there, with his Bible, continued to paint with ever-increasing power. Augustus John, writing a sketch about him, concluded,
"Thus in gloom and mystery, illuminated solely by the transposed sunlight of his genius, the greatest Dutchman dies. Content, we must think, that he had neglected nothing."
In the 1600s, another great change took place in Western art. The center of wealth and fashion moved to Versailles, the palace of Louis XIV outside of Paris. This was the great era of royal France. In this painting of Italian players, Antoine Watteau, the Parisian, succeeds in capturing the spirit of his generation and sets a precedent for his successors. With the age of Louis XV, the ornately majestic yielded to the pleasurable. Fragonard's Swing is mirrored the light-hearted world of charming make-believe of the aristocracy. In these breezy hours of her history, grace became the symbol and allurement of France. And its genius was Boucher, who painted this Venus. Boucher will remain not only the painter, but also the eyewitness, the representative, and the embodiment of his age. While France flourished, Spain declined in power. At the end of the 18th century, a great Spanish painter appeared, Goya y Lucientes, a master reporter of facts and faces of a crumbling empire. This is an early Goya portrait, a society portrait. With a deft brush, Goya seems to be ridiculing the overdressed lady and her pug dog. There is a note of malice in it, almost like an echo of the rumblings of a social system in collapse.
The ancient art of Spain is buried in Goya's tomb. He came just in time to gather up and perpetuate all of this.
Across the Channel, a particularly English type of art flourished in the 18th century. This peculiarly English art sought to perfect, to eliminate the irregularities of nature. Its foremost champions made portrait painting an art of decoration. Often weak in likeness, English portraits harmonize with the graceful pattern of life in the England of George III. English painters were also skilled in landscapes. The Salisbury Cathedral is characteristic of John Constable's lyrical view of his native countryside. But it was in the powerful seascapes of Turner that a new era in painting was foreshadowed. Seeing this painting exhibited, a critic of his day wrote,
Turner paints for posterity and allows for the effect of time as Robin Hood when he shot allowed for the wind.
The passage of the 18th into the 19th century was full of turmoil. It shook the established order of the Western world. In Europe, Napoleon. In America, Washington. In spite of the revolution, the leaders of the young Republic of America still spoke and thought in English. Almost all American painters, including the creator of this picture, Edward Savage, were strongly influenced by the English style of painting. This portrait of Colonel Guy Johnson and his Mohawk secretary comes from the brush of Benjamin West, the father of American painting. His model, Colonel Johnson, was superintendent of Indian affairs along the frontier. Benjamin West, though born in Pennsylvania, rose to become president of the Royal Academy in England and teacher of a generation of American painters. One of them, John Singleton Copley, was commissioned to paint Lord Howe, the English commander against George Washington. Another of West's pupils, Gilbert Stuart, returned to America, where he made many portraits of Washington and his contemporaries. In America, Stuart began to paint more realistically. He left us a vivid record of men and women who carved a nation out of the wilderness. Mrs. Yates, for instance, the practical, hard-working, and stern wife of a New York merchant. Alongside the trained artists of the New World, untrained painters began to record the events of their time. These painters are called primitives. Winslow Homer's Breezing Up is an example of American realism in art as it began to develop independently of its European models around 1850. This artist of the Civil War era stated his artistic creed in these words.
When I have selected the thing carefully, I paint it exactly as it is.
George Inness left in this landscape of the Lackawanna Valley another faithful historic record and realistic work of art. But despite the independent art movement, American painters continued to go across to London and Paris for inspiration. Probably the best known of American painters of Victorian England was Whistler. This painting of a famous Irish beauty was rejected by the regular academicians, but was exhibited in the Salon of Rejected Painters in 1863 in Paris, where Whistler's work shared the jeers and laughter of the public with the canvases of Manet, Cézanne, and other future greats. More adventurous than Whistler, the French painter Édouard Manet used an experimental technique of bold, exciting design in color in his Gare Saint-Lazare. These experiments gave rise to a new type of art known as Impressionism. Renoir's Girl with a Watering Can is representative of the new style, a style based on the theory that what we actually see in nature consists of nothing more than minute flecks of rainbow hues of color. The Impressionists duplicated this effect and wove, as it were, a web of brilliantly colored brushstrokes which from a distance fuse in the eye to form an image. This palace in Venice, for instance, painted by Claude Monet. Or his sun-bathed cathedral in Rouen. Another painter of this movement, Pissarro, recorded casual everyday scenes such as this throng of people on a Paris boulevard, painted in 1897. Studies of the ballet are the best-known paintings of Edgar Degas. An American woman, Mary Cassatt was greatly admired by her painter colleagues in Paris for her sense of style and composition. When the Master Degas saw this painting of her Irish maid, he bought it and kept it to the end of his life. Another aspect of life in Paris was recorded by Toulouse-Lautrec, the unfortunate cripple who wandered around the cabarets and bars in the small hours of the morning, making sketches on wrapping paper like this one drawn in 1892. Following the Impressionists during the last decades of the 19th century, a new group was formed in Paris known as the Post-Impressionists. Van Gogh was a member of this group of painters who searched boldly for new ways of expressing the mood of their time. This is Paul Gauguin, another prominent post-impressionist. He fled Paris in search of freedom and unspoiled nature. In the South Sea Islands, he created a style of flat, decorative painting. Gauguin, Van Gogh, and other post-impressionists herald the originality and bold individuality of the artists of the 20th century. The story of art is like the story of life itself, a story of unending changes, men of each period expressing the turmoil and aspirations of their time, and speaking to posterity in their contemporary language. A collection of paintings is indeed a treasure house of man's noblest efforts to convey his beliefs, hopes, and fears to his own and to future generations. And so, our voyage leads us into the present day, where the story of art continues to be written in paint and stone. As Franklin Roosevelt said when he accepted the building and collections on behalf of the American nation,
dedication of this gallery to a living past and to a greater and more richly living future is the measure of the earnestness of our intention that the freedom of the human spirit shall go on through.